Hi, I'm Peggy Farron, and we are live with the Understand Photography show where we talk about travel and nature photography, except for today. Today we're going to just talk about basic photography. We're going to talk about the exposure triangle and shooting in the manual setting. If you were watching a few minutes ago, you know we had some technical problems, so we're starting over. Hopefully we'll go through smooth sailing this time. Today's guest is the most fabulous intern at Understand Photography, Sierra Baldwin. Hi, Sierra.
Hello.
Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
She's funny. We did a lot of practicing together before the first show, and she was pretending to be Artie Morris. It was hilarious, but we didn't record any of that. So. Oh, anyway, so today we're going to talk about shooting in the manual setting and the exposure triangle. Let's get started right away. The first thing you need to know about shooting in the manual setting is you need to know about your meter. Each camera has a meter built right into it. And what's a meter? What does a meter do? What does a meter do?
It measures light.
Yeah,
It tells you,
a meter measures in general,
yeah.
but our camera meter measures the light, which we need. The word photography, you know what the word photography means?
I think I actually do. It means writing with light.
Yep. Sometimes they say painting with light.
Yeah,
but yeah,
painting. Okay.
Writing or painting with light. So it's all about the light. So the meter is going to measure the light. So if you have your camera ready, look in your viewfinder, and your viewfinder is your eyepiece, okay? And if you don't have an eyepiece, then look at the back of your camera and look for your meter. All right, on most DSLRs, your meter is along the bottom of your viewfinder. You're going to see your shutter speed number, your aperture number, and then your meter in most cases. Is that where your meter is?
Mm-hmm. On the bottom.
And what kind of camera do you have?
Nikon D7100.
7100. I'm going to forget that, I know, but anyway. There are some cases where the meter is up the side of the camera, like the newest Canon 7D is like that, and it's so difficult for us Canon shooters because we're so, like for me, I have several different Canon cameras, and all of them have the meter in the exact same place. I don't have a Canon 7D, but I borrowed one, and it's so confusing because you're not used to looking over there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you have a bridge camera or a mirrorless camera, your meter might be somewhere else. It might be along the side, it might be along the bottom. Some of them don't even have is it called a graph?
I don't know.
I don't know either. Well, you know, the little thing. I don't know what it's called. Anyway, some of them will just have like +2 if you're 2 stops overexposed, or -1 if you're 1 stop underexposed, and then 0 when you have a good exposure. So once you find your meter, it's your job to get the meter to 0. Okay, when the meter's at 0, that means your camera says, hey, that's a good exposure. That's the right amount of light coming in to the camera. Now you have a story about your meter, right? You started as a film photographer, right?
I did.
Okay.
And that was a couple summers ago, and I didn't really know anything about the settings in photography or what any of it meant. But I just started taking pictures, and I noticed that there was a meter on, well, I didn't know it was a meter at the time, but I noticed something at the bottom of my viewfinder that said like a minus sign, a 0, and a plus sign. And so I would just take pictures randomly, and like sometimes I would just try to get it on 0 because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. And I remember one specific picture that I really wanted to take. It was my dog yawning, and it was the perfect time, and I knew it as I clicked it, but then I had to wait for it to get developed. And it was basically the only picture that came out well, which was complete luck. But all the other ones were like black or white, or
like
it just,
when you say black, you mean so underexposed
Yeah.
that it didn't even come out.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
white is overexposed, like, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, well, I've been there too.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, why did you decide to shoot in the manual setting? Or was that the only thing the camera did?
You know, I think it had multiple settings, but I just wanted to be good at it. So I just thought I'd go for it.
But you didn't take a class?
No.
You just winged it?
Yep, I winged it.
Wow, I'm impressed.
It was fun because like I wasn't really like I was such a beginner that everything was new and exciting.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So.
So the meter needs to be at 0,
Mhm.
okay? So that's your first step when you're shooting in the manual setting. Learn to get your meter to 0, and we're going to talk about that today. So there are 3 components to the exposure triangle. Now remember when we said the meter's at 0, that means that your camera thinks you have a good exposure. And we're talking about exposure, we're talking about light. How much light is coming into your camera, okay? That's your exposure. A good exposure means what?
How much light's coming into the camera? Oh, a good exposure
yeah.
means there's enough.
It's the right amount.
Yeah.
It's not too much. It's not too little. It's just right. And usually, in 90% of the cases, if your meter's on 0, you're going to have a good exposure, okay? You might have a terrible picture because you might know nothing about composition, or your shutter speed might be too slow, or whatever. But you're going to, if your meter's on 0, the lighting is going to be correct in most cases, all right? So we're going to talk about the exposure triangle, which is 3 different components in your camera that let light come into your camera, or they stop light from coming into your camera. And as you said, the word photography means writing with light. So it's all about light coming into your camera to make a pretty picture, hopefully a pretty picture. The 3 components in the exposure triangle are ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. We're going to talk first about ISO. What does ISO stand for?
Well, I just recently learned. I think it's International Service Organizations. Is that?
Well, you got closer.
Is that right?
You got closer this time.
Oh, what is it?
ISO stands for International Standards Organization.
Okay.
It's the standardized industry scale for measuring sensitivity to light. Now, I didn't know that either. I was a professional photographer for 12 years before I started teaching. And I developed a class. The very first class I developed was how to shoot in the manual setting. And I thought, I have no idea what ISO means. And so I looked it up and I went, wow, I guess I don't care either, because does it matter? Doesn't matter what it stands for, because you just need to know what it does. All right, so remember I told you that your camera is either letting light come into the camera or stopping light from coming into the camera. Mm-hmm. I said that's what each of the 3 components do.
Yeah.
But guess what? It's not really true.
Okay.
With ISO, it's just easier to remember because it behaves that way. What ISO does is it controls how sensitive your camera's image sensor is to the light. So the lower the ISO number, like if you have ISO 100, the less sensitive to the light your camera is. The higher the ISO number, like ISO 6400, the more sensitive your sensor is to the light. But that, to me, that's confusing. So it's just easier for me to think about, okay, if I'm at ISO 6400, I'm letting more light in. If I'm at ISO 100, I'm letting less light in, because it's behaving the same way. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Okay, most cameras are calibrated for the best quality pictures at ISO 100. So if you can, it's best to shoot at ISO 100, but that's not always practical, right?
Right.
There are always 2 questions you have to ask yourself when you're going to shoot in the manual setting. The first one is, what effect do I want? And the second one is, what are my limitations? Well, with ISO, the only thing you have is a limitation. And what do you know what the limitation is? What's the limitation of ISO?
As you get a higher ISO, it's a more noisier picture.
Yep.
So it's more like less quality. You lose quality as you get a higher ISO.
Yeah. So if you're shooting at ISO 100, you're going to have the best quality and a nice clear picture. If you're shooting at ISO 6400, you might have what we call noise in your picture. And noise, can you explain noise?
I would think it kind of looks like fuzzy a little bit. And the picture starts to break down where you can see like the pixels more.
It's like you see like little specks.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, some people say grainy, but it's not really grain. It's noise. I mean, it looks like noise. It's just a bunch of specks and things like that. So if you know that you're going to be taking pictures on a regular basis under low light conditions, buy a camera that is made for that. You're going to see in the specifications, this is good at high ISO capabilities or something like that. So you want to buy a camera that's good at that. I have several different Canon cameras, and the main two I use for weddings, one of them is better at low light than the other one. All right, so usually the first component you change in the exposure triangle is your ISO. And how do you determine what ISO to put your camera in? Do you know? You do know. I know you know.
The environment that you're in.
Yeah.
How much light's around.
So what do you mean by that?
Well, you always want to have the lowest ISO possible. So I would think if it's sunny out, you'd want to do ISO 100.
Okay, what if it's like overcast, or what if you're in, like right here, we're inside, but we've got nice light in here, but it's not as bright as it is outside. What would you put your ISO on inside here?
Right now in this situation?
Yeah.
Maybe like 400?
I would too.
Okay. Good.
If I'm inside the house or inside a room that has pretty good lighting, I'm going to either be at ISO 400 or ISO 800. All right, so what about if you're going out and you're going to a wedding and you're shooting in a dark banquet room?
Maybe 1600 or 3200?
Yep, that's exactly right. So you change your ISO first, but you hardly change it at all. In fact, when I do weddings, I change my ISO, I change my ISO maybe 3 times. So I start in the bride's room. We go in the room, she's getting ready in the bathroom and it's kind of dark, but then there's this big, sliding door that overlooks the beach or something, and it's 2 or 3 hours before sunset, so the sun is just blaring in. So, ideally I should be at ISO 100 over by the window, but then ISO 1600 when I'm in the bathroom with her. So I put it at 800 because it's a middle of the road ISO. All right, so then I live in Southwest Florida. Where are all my weddings?
At the beach.
At the beach. So what do I change my ISO to?
Probably 100.
Yep.
Because you usually have to go a little bit before sunset. Maybe
usually
like 2 hours?
It's usually an hour and a half to 2 hours before sunset, most weddings.
So that's pretty bright out.
It's really bright. It's not only bright, the sun's shooting at me.
Okay.
I'm shooting into the sun. It's bright.
Yeah.
In fact, it's one of my pet peeves when people bring, they have, I'm going to bring this photographer from some other place, and they're not accustomed to shooting in such harsh conditions. We have it tough over here, but we can do it. All right, so I leave my ISO on 100 all the way through the wedding, even through sunset. And then I go into the dark banquet room, and then what?
You're probably going to change it to 1600, depending how high quality of the camera is with ISO.
Yeah, that's
Did
exactly.
that make any sense?
No, it was exactly right, because
Yeah.
I have an older camera, Canon 60D, and that really, I can't put that camera any higher than 1600 without getting noise. So that camera, I put at ISO 1600. I also use a 6D. That camera, I put at 3200 because it's just better in the low light. So, but that's it. That's 3 times in an entire wedding. I could be there for 9-10 hours, and I'm only going to change my ISO 3 times. So, again, I think it's a little more confusing to learn ISO, but fortunately you don't need to change it as often. All right, so if you do have your camera handy, look at your camera and see if you can figure out how to change your ISO and just kind of play around with it a little bit. How do you change your ISO on your camera? On your Nikon D... I already forgot.
7100.
7100.
You just press a button and turn a dial.
So the button actually says ISO on it.
It says it to the side of the button.
Okay.
It's a secondary use for the button.
Oh, so the button has two uses.
Yeah.
Okay, I see.
I don't know what the other one is. Maybe like white balance or something.
Well, now you're going to have to go look it up.
Yeah, no, I have to see it.
So some cameras are going to have a button that says ISO right on it, so it's real simple to understand. Sometimes you're going to have to go in the menu. Some of the Canons, you're going to have to hit the Q button. Some of the Nikons, you're going to have to hit the I button. You know, you can, if you can't figure it out by just looking at the camera, you can look in your manual, or you can do an internet search, or you can look, you know, Understand Photography has a Facebook group where you can ask questions too, and there's lots of people that will help. All right, so we changed our ISO. That's the first component that we're going to change in the exposure triangle. Now that's not always the first component, but it's usually the first component. Ugh, that's hard to say over and over again. All right, so the second component in the exposure triangle is your aperture. The word aperture literally means hole, and I'm using literally correctly. So, did you know that?
Maybe.
Maybe, okay.
In one of my classes, they taught that.
So you have a hole that's letting in light. That's your aperture. The focal stop, we say f-stop, is the measurement of the hole. So that the f-stop is the measurement of the aperture, but we use those terms like they mean the same thing. We say, what's your f-stop, what's your aperture, and we're asking you the same question. So we're lazy. It's kind of how we are. So you can change your aperture to be a big wide hole or a little tiny hole. Now obviously, when you have a big hole, more light is coming into your camera. When you have a tiny little hole, less light is coming into your camera. That makes sense, right? It's easy. Aperture is easy. Big hole, lots of light. Little hole, tiny light. What's confusing about the aperture?
The f-stop that's associated with it.
The number. You mean the number?
The number, yeah. So if it's a big hole, it's f4 or f1.8, which doesn't make sense because it's a small number. And then if it's f11, it's a tiny hole. So you would think it would go the opposite way.
You would think it would go the opposite way. That was really, really hard for me when I was starting out. In fact, what I did was I memorized numbers. Mm-hmm. But when I started teaching this class, I had, you know, the f-stops up on the board with pictures. So you could see that f1, 2.8, let's say, was a big wide hole, and then f4 got a little smaller, f5, 6 smaller, f8 smaller, f11 smaller, all the way down to f22, which is like a little pinhole. And I was saying the same thing that we're saying. You know, it's easy to understand aperture, but it's hard to remember that the smaller number is the bigger hole. And some brainiac in the class says, well, you know what, that's just simple geometry. Oh, I felt bad because everybody in the whole class laughed because it was not simple to anybody else but him. Anyway, I made up a cheat sheet. When I first started, when I was trying to learn, I just kind of had a handwritten cheat sheet. But as I started teaching, I made a cheat sheet, and boy, I'll tell you what, I have perfected that thing over the years. It is a good cheat sheet now. So if you're watching this show, if you go to understandphotography.com, in the show notes for today's show, episode 3, you can have a free download of Peggy's exposure cheat sheet, and you will love it, I promise. It just makes things so much easier to understand because there's only 3 components to the exposure triangle, but each component has its funny little thing that you need to learn about. Mm-hmm. So when deciding on which component to change, what are the 2 questions you're going to ask yourself?
What effect am I trying to achieve, and what limitations do I have? Exactly.
So aperture's effect. All right, we already learned with ISO that you really just have a limitation, and that limitation is a high ISO will give you noisy pictures. Your aperture's effect is what we call depth of field. All right, when you have a very wide aperture, such as f1.2 or f2.8, you're going to have a shallow depth of field. So what is a shallow depth of field? A shallow depth of field means you have just a very narrow point of focus in your picture. So let's say I was going to take a picture of Sierra right here, and I'm this close to her. So I'm going to pick up my camera, and I want to have a shallow depth of field. I want the background to go blurry. So my first decision is going to be my aperture. I'm going to put my aperture at f1.8 or 1.2. I'm going to take and then I'm going to change my other settings to get my meter to 0. I'm going to take a picture, and she's going to be nice and sharp, but the background is going to be blurry. That's what we call a shallow depth of field. So then I change my mind. It's not exactly what I wanted. I want the background to be sharp. Well, then I change my aperture to probably f11. And then if I change my aperture, I shut down some of the light. So I need to let more light in either through the ISO or the shutter speed. So then I take the picture, I get my meter to 0, I take the picture of Sierra at f11, and in this case, she's still nice and sharp just like the other picture, but now the background is pretty sharp as well. So that's the effect that your aperture will do. If you are a children's photographer or a macro photographer, a lot of times we love a shallow depth of field where we like the background to go blurry. Actually, the foreground will go blurry too. So that's shallow depth of field. Love that look. For me, who specializes in family portraits and large family portraits, often I'll have 16 to 20, 30 people in a family portrait. I better be at least at f8 or probably f11 because I need every single person in that family to be sharp. Landscape photographers prefer a sharper or greater depth of field. So, shallow depth of field, what's your aperture?
Small, so like f1.8.
Small what? Small number.
Small number,
wide
big,
aperture.
Yeah, wide.
That's why it's
big hole.
confusing.
Yeah.
Okay. So for a shallow depth of field, f2.8. Great depth of field,
f22.
22 would be extreme
Really?
because you get so little light in there. You need light in your camera.
f11.
F11
Okay.
probably in most cases. 8 or 11. That's what I'm usually at. I just had something I wanted to say about the aperture, and now I can't remember what it was. Well, anyway, look in your camera manual or Google it or ask us on the Understand Photography Facebook group, which is a different page than this page. Facebook, we love Facebook, but sometimes things are confusing. We have a group because it's interactive. This page is not quite as interactive, so ask in the group, hey, I have a Nikon D7100.
Yep.
I got it right. I can't figure out how to change my aperture. Well, somebody's going to tell you because it's actually pretty easy, isn't it?
It's actually helped me out before that group because I wanted help with a lens.
Oh, to buy a new
and
lens?
people gave me great recommendations. So.
Yeah. We've got a lot of super technical people in that group that they love just to research things. And all right, so aperture. You're going to choose your aperture based on the effect you're looking for. So we've got ISO, or aperture, and now the third component in the exposure triangle is your shutter speed. Okay, shutter speed. You have a curtain inside your camera that opens and closes to let light in or stop light from coming in. So if it stays open for a long time, a lot of light comes in, right? If you open and close it really, really fast, just a little bit of light gets in there. That makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty easy to understand. In fact, one of the nice things about the shutter speed is you can actually hear it. So sometimes you can hear if it's too slow. When I'm training people, because I train a lot of people at this point, I can hear, I'm like, I think your shutter speed's too slow. And they're like, how do you know? You can't even see, but I can hear it. So we measure shutter speed in seconds and fractions of a second. Actually, more often, fractions of a second. So 1/100th of a second is pretty moderate shutter speed. It's kind of an average shutter speed, really. 1/1000th of a second, whew, that's a tongue twister. 1/1000th of a second is really fast. So you're just letting a little tiny bit of light in. And then like 1 full second or 30 seconds, that's really, really, really a long time to have the shutter open. So tons and tons and tons of light are coming in. Have you heard the expression long exposure?
Mm-hmm.
And what does that mean?
You just keep the the shutter speed's really slow, so there's a lot of light coming into the camera.
Yep, yep.
Usually you do it at night,
Yeah.
so like the lights will become like,
Streaky.
yeah, streaky, and it looks
That's-
really nice.
Or something else, you also see like people who like to do the star trails.
Yeah, I really want to do that.
That's a long exposure.
Yeah.
Or, you know, here what we see a lot because of where we live, we see a lot of people have a long exposure, slow shutter speed with the waves so that the water just looks like what? Like soup.
Silky. And,
Silky
yeah.
soup. So that's kind of cool. This is really fun to learn how to shoot in the manual setting.
Mm-hmm.
Really, really fun. Okay, so your shutter speed controls your motion blur. It's not the same kind of blur as a shallow depth of field blur, all right? All right, so I'm gonna have you think this through. All right, so you think about the light is writing to your sensor, right? The word photography means writing with light. So the light is writing to your sensor. If the shutter is open for a long time and anything that's moving is going to be blurry because the light is writing to the sensor while that thing is moving. So it's just going to be documenting it here and then here and then here. I just put my hand in front of my face on TV. So it's documenting what's happening, and that looks like blur at the end of, you know, when you look at the picture. So here's an exercise. You can try this at home, all right? Put your camera on a tripod, or if you don't have a tripod, set it on a table, you know, up kind of high, not too low, somewhere where the camera will be really, really, really steady, all right? Put your shutter speed on 1/20th of a second. Now, obviously, I forgot to tell you, but you can go and try to figure out how to change your shutter speed either by looking in your manual, ask somebody on the internet or whatever. So once you learn how to change your shutter speed, put it on 1/20th of a second. Change your ISO and your aperture until your meter gets to 0, all right? So your camera's ready for a good exposure with a kind of a slow shutter speed. Put your timer on your camera for 10 seconds because even pressing the shutter button shakes your camera and you could have blurry pictures. So put your timer on 10 seconds and then take the picture and move your hand around like up and down in front of the camera, okay? Then look at the picture. If you're at 1/20th of a second, what's your hand going to look like?
1/20th of a second? It'd probably be really blurry.
Yeah. All right, so now put your shutter speed on maybe, I don't know, 1/200th of a second. Change your aperture and your ISO until your meter gets to what?
0.
0, right? Do the same thing, use the timer, wave your hand in front of the camera, and this time what happens?
It'll be sharper.
Your hand will not be blurry. That's because when the shutter's really fast, it freezes the motion since it only had time to get your hand like one time. If it's open for a long time, it's getting your hand as it's moving. If it's open for just literally a split second, yeah. It's only going to get that, so it freezes motion. So, ISO, aperture, shutter speed. Those are the 3 components you need to get the exposure triangle to get to your meter to 0. Of those 3 components, you can have a combination of many different ISO, aperture, and shutter speed settings, and you have the same exact exposure. So when I say that is, you take the picture of the same exact thing, your meter's on 0, change all your settings like crazy, meter can still be at 0. You'll just have different effects, right? Just like when I talked about taking the picture of Sierra. I'm going to have the same amount of light, but a different effect. And sometimes the effects are good and sometimes they're not. That's why you need to know what you're doing. So what are the 2 questions again? We're going to keep repeating them.
What effect am I trying to achieve, and what are my limitations?
All right, so what's your limitation on ISO?
If you lose quality as you go get a higher ISO.
High ISO means you're going to have noise. Okay.
Yes.
But there's really no effect other than that on ISO that I can think of anyway, that I've ever heard of, I should say. Okay, what about with the shutter speed? What's your limitation there?
If it's too slow, it will look blurry.
Yep. So what's the slowest shutter speed that you can use if you're not using a tripod? If you're hand holding your camera?
1/60.
Good girl. Sierra took my class. And you know, I threw her under the bus, but because our first recording didn't work, now she's up on everything.
No, I knew it all the whole time.
All right, so one of the things I want you guys to tattoo it onto the inside of your eyelids. If you are hand holding that camera, make sure your shutter speed is 1/60th of a second or faster. If you go down to 1/30th of a second, you're going to have blurry pictures. Now, when I was young, I could hold my breath, brace myself against the wall, hold my camera correctly, and by correctly I mean with my left hand underneath the camera like a shelf, like a steady shelf, my arms tucked in, hold my breath. I could take a steady picture at 1/30th of a second. I can't anymore now that I'm older. When I was young I could, but it was hard even then, you know?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a limitation of your shutter. What's the effect of your shutter?
Like what
your
could
shutter.
you do?
Yeah.
Well, you could do the long exposure.
Which means?
Which means like the streaky effect.
Yeah.
Or you could do like a nice silky water effect.
Yeah.
Or
Zoom blur.
Oh yeah, zoom blur.
Zoom blur.
I love zoom blur.
By the way, we have an article on understandphotography.com that Joe Fitzpatrick wrote about zoom blur. And there's no search button on understandphotography.com, but if you type in the address www.understandphotography.com space zoom blur, that's how you search, okay? And it'll come up with the article. It's really easy to do and really fun. Go ahead. Freezing motion.
Yeah, freezing motion. So if you're like at a sporting event, you're going to need a fast shutter speed.
Good.
Or maybe wildlife, you'd probably need a fast one
Yeah,
too.
what about birds?
Yeah, really fast.
Yeah. And a lot of times with birds, you're hand holding the camera, so
that's true, yeah.
That's another reason. It's another reason to understand what you're doing, because a long lens, if you're zoomed out to 600 millimeters, you're going to have more chance of blur. So you need a fast shutter speed to stop the motion blur.
Mm-hmm.
The longer the lens, the faster the shutter speed you need too. Okay, so aperture. Did we talk about aperture yet?
No.
Okay, so what is the effect of aperture?
You could have the shallow depth of field, which is the blurry-ish background.
Okay.
Or you could do the bokeh lighting. So if it's like, I don't know how to explain it, but it's if you had something in focus and then in the background you had like lights.
Mm-hmm.
The lights will go to like big globes of blurry like
And they're cool.
things.
That's so cool. We love that.
I love those. Yeah.
All right, so that's one effect. What's another effect?
Well, you could just have it really sharp if you want everything
You
sharp.
need everything sharp. Yeah. So everything sharp, you're going to have a small tiny
hole.
aperture like f11 or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Another thing we didn't talk about was the starburst effect. If you want to make the sun or the stars or something look like little stars, how do you do that?
Well, I've tried this before because I didn't understand how to do that, but you have to, so you kind of point your camera directly at the sun.
Mm-hmm.
I like to have something in front of it so it kind of like blocks it, but you can see the sun like shining.
Oh, like through the leaves or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you just make the aperture really small, like f22 is usually what I've
really
done.
small.
Yeah. And
And
then
in fact,
fix all the other settings to whatever it'll go to.
when I started teaching, okay, I started my career as a photography assistant. So when I bought my first lens, I bought a $2,500 lens. That was my very first lens. So when I started teaching and people came to my class with the kit lenses that come with the Canon Rebels and the Nikon D3300s or whatever, I had trouble relating to them, so I bought one of those lenses. And I took it out one time, and that lens closes all the way to f36.
Wow.
Yeah, I had to starburst all day long that day.
Wow, that's crazy.
So yeah, the starburst effect is from your aperture. So if that's the effect you want, that's an aperture thing.
Mm-hmm.
Limitation. Do you know what limitation?
For aperture?
Yeah. We didn't get this far last time.
know, I don't know.
I'll tell you.
I don't know that.
Limitation is your lens.
Oh, okay. That
Okay,
makes
so
sense.
remember I bought that kit lens. It opens to f3.5 at the widest aperture, but that's only when you're zoomed out. If you zoom in to get closer to something, it goes to f5.6. So it's not gonna be as easy to have a shallow depth of field with that lens.
Okay.
If you want a really shallow depth of field, you got to buy another lens, which is the problem we have in photography in general, right?
Yeah.
We always want
definitely.
more lenses, and we just need more and more and more expensive lenses. So, although there is the nifty 50 lens. Do you have that lens?
I do.
And how that opens to what aperture?
I think mine does like 1.8.
1.8.
Yeah.
So both Nikon and Canon make what we call a nifty 50 lens. And I actually have an article on that on understandphotography.com as well. So remember, understandphotography.com space nifty 50. That's how you search for the article. But that lens opens, it's a 50 millimeter lens, so it doesn't zoom. It's what we call a prime. Prime lens just means it doesn't zoom. So prime lens doesn't zoom, 50 millimeters, which is, it's not real wide, it's kind of average, but it's very lightweight, which is nice, and it opens to f1.8. So it's a really fun lens to learn on. It's a fun lens to travel with because it doesn't weigh very much.
Mm-hmm.
I love that about it. All right, so the number one thing you need to remember when shooting in the manual setting is what?
The number one thing?
The number one thing to remember that you just guessed at when you were a film photographer.
Oh, well, always get the meter on 0.
You got it. The meter needs to be on 0.
Yep.
What's the second thing that I told you to tattoo onto the inside of your eyelids?
You have to, if you're hand holding your camera, the lowest shutter speed you can have is 1/60.
Yep, 1/60th of a second is the slowest you want to go with your shutter speed. The biggest, the most common problem that I see with our students is that their pictures are blurry because their shutter speed is too slow. So that is the most important thing you need to remember after getting your meter to 0. All right? We do have a class, short little commercial here. We have a live class called the 4 Weeks to Proficiency in Photography, where we go over everything we talked about here, but of course in a lot more detail because we find out what kind of camera you have that everybody has in the class ahead of time. So we actually teach you, hit this button, turn that dial, whatever. We teach you exactly what to do step by step. And then of course there are pictures. That helps a lot too. You took that class, right?
I did, yeah.
Actually, Sierra took that class while she was on vacation and did her homework while she was on vacation. I was really impressed by that because the biggest problem that people have is doing their homework. And would you say the homework is at least 50% of the class, right?
Yeah.
Because you might take the class, the 2-hour class, it's live every week. I teach it live. I'm there. You can ask me questions right while I'm teaching it. On the internet, though. But then, okay, you say, okay, I think I understand it. But if you don't practice it, by the next week, you don't even remember what I taught you.
Right.
So if you practice it, and we give specific instructions on how to practice, like the first day, I think the first homework assignment is Aperture. So we teach you, change your aperture, look at the difference, change your aperture again, until you really, really see the difference in what your aperture does. Same thing with shutter speed, ISO, all that kind of stuff. Our next live class starts October 20th, and of course the information is on understandphotography.com. And one of the nice little bonuses is that we record every show, and you have access to those recordings for life. And I'm talking about my life, not your life, because you might be younger than me, I don't know. All right, so shooting in the manual setting doesn't have to be daunting. You just have to force yourself to practice. Put that dial in M, put the mode in M, and just leave it there and force yourself to practice. The more you practice, the more times you're going to just like have all these like aha moments. You're going to experience is the best teacher, but if you have a little bit of instruction and experience, that's ideal. So you're really going to start getting it the more you practice. If you're local in this area, come on some of our free photo walks. If you're not local, join your local camera club and go, or get a camera buddy and go out and shoot. It's so much fun to have control over what your images are going to look like, and your creativity is going to go through the roof. I was bragging to Sierra the other day. We had an engagement session, and I was like, man, I was on my game. But if I didn't know what I was doing, I would never have gotten half those shots, because some of what happened is it got dark, and I didn't have did I have a tripod with me? I had one with me, but I wasn't using it.
Yeah.
So, I did have some blurry shots, but I had a lot of good shots. Mm-hmm. And if I hadn't been shooting in the manual setting, I wouldn't have been able to get them, because when you're shooting in any automatic setting, and I'm talking about even what they call the professional modes like aperture priority or shutter priority, you're still letting the camera make your decisions. You make the decisions, and you are going to be so empowered. You're going to take such better pictures. Okay. I would like to thank Sierra Baldwin for being my guest today. I think it's easier when I have a guest than just to talk into the camera by myself. Next week, September 30th, we have another big name guest, almost as big as name as Sierra Baldwin. Jim Zuckerman has been a professional photographer for, I don't know, over 40 years. He is one of the top photography instructors in the world. He's written many books. He's authored several photography classes. He is going to be right here in Naples, Florida, with me on September 30th for our Facebook Live show. And then the next day, he's going to be here at our camera club, which we will have the link to that in the show notes, as well as the link to our show Anyway, Jim Zuckerman. Actually, he's on a tour in China right now. You've got to go on his website, jimzuckerman.com. He is amazing. I know a lot of you have probably already heard of him. He's going to be a great guest. Don't forget to go on the understandphotography.com website in the show notes for today, episode 3, to get my exposure cheat sheet. This is Peggy Theron. Thank you for watching episode 3 of the Understand Photography Show.